In the summer of 1883, while settlers built wooden cisterns and dug shallow wells, Samuel Morrow lit bonfires on a granite outcrop. Day after day, he heated the rock until it glowed, then shocked it with icy creek water, fracturing the stone inch by inch. His neighbors said he was wasting his strength. But Samuel wasn't digging for water. He was carving a vault into the granite that would hold liquid water through the deadliest freeze, or entomb his family's last hope when the blizzards hit. Samuel Morrow was a 34-year-old homesteader on a rocky claim in the Black Hills. His wife, Cora, was pregnant with their third child, and their two young sons hauled water from a creek that vanished under ice each winter. The family's wooden cistern exploded every spring when the thaw revealed the damage. But Samuel remembered an old quarryman's secret. Fire and ice could crack granite. He believed a cistern carved deep into living rock, covered and insulated, would never freeze. What he didn't know was whether the stone would yield a vault that saved his family, or a deadly trap of fractured rubble when they needed water most. The Black Hills in 1883 were still raw. Homesteads clung to rocky slopes, wind howled through pine brakes, and water ruled everything. A family could survive cold. They could survive poor soil. They could not survive without a winter-long supply of liquid water. The Morrow claim sat on a granite shelf where the creek froze solid by November, sometimes as early as late October. The year before, a neighbor named Henry Toller had watched his wooden cistern swell, crack, and drain its entire reserve into frozen earth while a blizzard raged for 4 days. His wife and youngest daughter nearly died of thirst before a break in the weather allowed a sled run to a spring 3 miles away. That was the price of a shallow wood-lined tank. Ice expands, timber splinters, and what you stored is gone when you need it most. Samuel Morrow knew that story. He also knew that the ground beneath his boots held a different promise. Granite, if you could shape it, was nearly impervious. Deep below the frost line, the earth stays warm enough to keep water liquid. A stone cistern dug straight into the bedrock, covered and insulated, would never freeze. But cutting a vault out of solid granite without dynamite was a task that laughed at muscle and iron alone. Most frontier families dug a shallow well and prayed. Samuel decided to burn his way down. The idea was older than the country itself. Quarrymen in New England, Egyptian stonecutters, even Roman engineers had used fire setting to fracture stubborn rock. You build a hot fire directly on the stone, let the heat sink deep, then shock it with cold water. The sudden contraction cracks the surface and you scrape away the loose fragments. Repeat, day after brutal day. Samuel had seen it done once as a boy in Vermont when his uncle split a foundation ledge for a barn. He remembered the hiss of steam, the sharp pop of breaking stone. Now he needed that memory to become a cistern. Cora was 6 months along when he lit the first fire. Their two sons, Caleb and Henry, gathered dry pine boughs while Samuel stacked thick logs across the widest, flattest outcrop behind the cabin. The granite was dark gray, flecked with quartz, dense enough to turn a pickaxe with every strike. He doused the pile with kerosene and touched a match. The flame roared up, and for the first time in weeks, a column of heat pushed back against the mountain chill. The boys stood back, eyes wide. Cora watched from the porch, one hand pressed low against the moving child inside her. For hours, Samuel fed the fire. The stone beneath glowed faintly red at the center, then orange, and a network of hairline cracks began to trace across the surface like slow lightning. When the granite was as hot as he could stand, he signaled the boys and they rushed forward with a bucket brigade from the creek. Ice-cold water hit the scorched rock. The scream of steam was immediate and violent. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a sound like a muffled gunshot cracked through the homestead, then another, and another as the granite split along invisible seams. Fragments of stone the size of soup bowls popped free and skittered across the ground. The boys cheered. Samuel simply exhaled and reached for the hammer. But here's the thing no textbook could prepare him for. Fire setting is maddeningly slow. The hot work, the soaking, the scraping, all of it yielded only 2 or 3 inches of depth per day. After a week, the bowl in the granite was barely deep enough to bury a man's knee. After a month, Samuel could stand in it, but his shoulders were still above ground. All the while, the season turned. The aspen leaves above the creek went yellow, then fell. The morning frost grew heavier, lingering into midday. The creek thickened with slush ice that made the water colder and the thermal shock more violent, which helped the cracking but punished the men who handled the buckets. Henry Toller rode over one afternoon, his hands shoved deep into his coat. He stood beside the deepening pit without speaking for a long time, watching Samuel spread fresh coals across the granite floor. Finally, he said, "You know, my cousin tried a rock cistern up near Deadwood 10 years ago, got about this far." He held his hand at waist height. Then a cold snap hit before he could finish. The water he'd left in the bottom froze, split the stone wide open sideways, and by spring the whole thing was a gravel pit. Cost him a team of oxen to haul the busted rock out. Cora had stepped quietly onto the porch. Henry's gaze flicked toward her, then back to Samuel. "Just saying," he added. "Winter don't negotiate, it just takes." Samuel hefted the bucket and poured the creek water himself. The steam billowed, and a fresh slab of granite cracked free like a thick pane of broken glass. He pried it out with a bar and tossed it onto the growing pile at the rim. "Then I'll finish before winter does," he said. What no one knew at the time was that winter was already on its way, moving faster than the calendar. By mid-October, the temperature at night plunged into the low 20s. The creek froze completely along the edges, forcing the boys to break ice before they could fill their buckets. The fire setting became more difficult because the water was so cold it sometimes flash froze on contact with the scorched granite, creating a skin of ice that insulated the stone instead of cracking it. Samuel had to wait, let the fire burn longer, get the rock hotter, then pour the water in such a way that the shock traveled deep before the surface froze. He learned to read the sound of the fracture. A sharp ping meant a clean crack. A dull thump meant the stone was resisting. He adjusted the fire's shape, the water's spread, the length of the burn. He was no longer just a farmer burning rock. He was becoming something between a stonemason and a man possessed. Cora saw it. She saw his hands, cracked and bleeding from cold and hammer work. She saw the way he fell asleep in the chair beside the stove without eating. She saw the hole growing inch by inch, and she saw the season dying around them. One evening, while Samuel sat mending his torn gloves by lantern light, she asked, "How deep does it have to be for the water to stay liquid?" Samuel thought for a moment. 6 feet, he said, "below frost line." "How much deeper are you?" He didn't answer right away. "About 4 feet." A pause. 4.5 maybe. Cora looked at him, and in the quiet of the cabin, with the wind beginning to tap at the shutters, she made a calculation of her own. She was 7 months pregnant. The snows would come in weeks, not months. If the cistern wasn't finished and sealed before the hard freeze, the whole excavation could split apart, just as Henry's cousins had, leaving them with nothing but a rubble-filled crater and a thirsty winter. Samuel hadn't just committed months of labor. He'd committed their only alternative to the gamble itself. The next morning, a traveler stopping for water on the ridge trail commented that he had seen snow on the highest peaks of the Bighorns a full 2 weeks earlier than usual. The old-timers in the basin, he said, were already talking of a hard winter, maybe the hardest in a generation. Samuel said nothing. He finished his coffee and walked to the granite pit, where the fire still smoldered from the night before. He knelt, pressed his palm flat against the rock floor, and felt the lingering warmth. Then he piled on fresh pine, struck the match, and watched the flames climb. Because deep inside that stone, just below the deepest crack he had yet made, lurked a pocket of ancient ooze, a seam of soft, fractured feldspar that would crumble the moment the surrounding granite was weakened. And Samuel Morrow, who could now read the sound of breaking rock like a language, did not yet know that the hardest test of all lay not in the cold above him, but in the secret fault hidden beneath his own 2 feet. The secret fault revealed itself on a Tuesday morning, 3 days before the first hard freeze. Samuel had built the fire hotter than usual, hopping to gain an extra inch before the cold closed in. The granite floor glowed a deep, dull orange, and when the boys brought the water, the steam erupted so violently that they stumbled backward. But this time, instead of the sharp, clean crack of parting stone, there came a low, wet rumble. A seam of pale, crumbly feldspar, rotten as old chalk, split open beneath the hammer. Fragments didn't just pop free, they collapsed inward like a jaw dropping loose. In seconds, a jagged gash nearly 2 feet long and as wide as a man's hand opened across the floor of the cistern. Samuel stared. The sound was wrong. The texture was wrong. This wasn't solid granite. It was a vein of decayed mineral that ran diagonally through the bedrock, a weakness the mountain had hidden for millennia until his fire and water found it. Now it gaped at him, a wound in the stone that threatened everything. Cora was at the edge of the pit before he spoke. She saw the crack and understood immediately. "Is it finished?" she asked, but her voice was already carrying the answer. No, it was worse than unfinished. It was compromised. Water poured into this fracture would drain away into the mountain, or worse, freeze inside the seam and pry the entire cistern apart from within. All those months of work, all the burned hands and sleepless nights, and now the rock itself had betrayed him. Samuel climbed out and stood in silence, staring at the ground. The boys waited nearby, their small faces tight with worry. He sent them to the cabin. Then he walked to the woodpile, sat down on the chopping block, and did something he had not allowed himself in months. He stopped moving. The wind moved through the bare aspen branches above the creek sheeted with thin ice. Somewhere a raven called twice and went quiet. The mountain had dealt him a losing hand, and for the first time he wasn't sure how to play it. That afternoon, Henry Toller returned. Word had already spread through the scattering of homesteads that the Morrow cistern was in trouble. Henry didn't arrive with sympathy. He stood at the rim of the pit, arms folded, and examined the fault line like a man reading a death sentence. Then he said, "Feldspar seam. That'll drink water faster than you can pour it. Even if you could seal it, ice will split it wide come January. You'd be better off filling the whole thing in and starting fresh somewhere else." Samuel didn't answer. He was still sitting on the chopping block, a stick of pine in his hands, turning it over and over. Henry waited, then shrugged and turned to leave. At his wagon, he paused. "There's a man over near Spearfish, name of Johann Decker, German stonecutter. Built a mill foundation out of a granite ledge, dealt with bad seams by burning clay and ash into them. Said it made a kind of glass seal. Don't know if it works, but it's something." He climbed onto the wagon and flicked the reins. "Something's better than a grave," he added, and the wagon creaked away. That last word hung in the air. Grave. Samuel thought about the winter, about Cora's baby due before the snows ended. He thought about a midwife struggling through drifts, a family with no water, a newborn with nothing to drink. The cistern was no longer just about convenience. It was about whether his family would live through the next 6 months. He didn't sleep that night. By lantern light, he mixed creek clay with powdered limestone from a small outcrop he had noticed near the ridge and a handful of wood ash. He shaped small balls and pressed them into the edges of the crack. Then, rather than building a full fire inside the pit, he carefully placed coals directly over the seam so the heat would concentrate along the fault. He kept the temperature lower, steady, the way a kiln fires pottery. He poured no water. Instead, he let the dry heat bake the clay mixture into the stone, watching as the ash flux began to fuse the surface. The rotten feldspar didn't absorb the seal. It melted just enough at the contact point to bond with the clay. By dawn, the seam was no longer a dark, hungry mouth. It was a smooth, gray scar, hard as fired brick. But Samuel had burned an entire night, and the freeze was now hours away. The cistern was still only 4.5 feet deep, not nearly enough to beat the frost line. He had to go deeper and fast. However, there was another problem. Firing the fault had stabilized the crack, but it also revealed that the rotten seam ran wider than he thought. If he continued digging straight down, he would re-expose the fault or weaken the patch. He would have to undercut it, carving a bowl-shaped chamber beneath the seam, a wider cavity that would trap water below the frost line while leaving the sealed fault above as a protective dome. It was a far more complex shape than a simple shaft, and every swing of the hammer risked a collapse. The weather turned that very morning. A gray ceiling of cloud rolled over the Black Hills, and the temperature dropped so sharply that the frost forming on the grass crackled underfoot. Cora, now in her 8th month, moved slowly but steadily, bringing him hot coffee and strips of dried venison while he worked. Caleb and Henry broke ice on the creek and brought buckets, their small faces red with cold. The air smelled like snow. Not the damp, soft scent of a gentle fall, but the metallic sting of a blizzard waiting beyond the peaks. Samuel began the undercutting. He angled his fires along the lower lip of the pit, burning the granite out from beneath the sealed fault. The stone here was harder, more resistant, and the fractures came in shallow flakes instead of deep slabs. He had to work hunched over, his back screaming, while the heat blasted upward into his face. The sweat froze on his skin the moment he turned away from the flames. At night, his hands curled into claws he could barely open. More than once, Cora caught him staring at the wall as if calculating something only he could see. Then, on the fifth day of the undercut, the crisis came. A deep crack snapped through the stone behind him, not in the floor but in the side wall of the cistern. A chunk of granite the size of a barrel lid shifted and dropped, landing with a boom that shook the whole pit. Dust blasted upward. Samuel threw himself against the opposite wall, heart hammering. When the dust settled, he saw that the collapse had come from the side where the fault had weakened the surrounding stone. The patch held, but the adjacent rock had given way from the redistribution of stress. The cistern was now wider than intended, a lopsided bowl with a raw, jagged wall, but the depth had increased by nearly a foot in that one violent moment. The mountain had taken a piece, but it had also given him what he needed: more space, more depth. He stood in the rubble, breathing hard, and realized he was now standing nearly 6 feet below the surface. The frost line was above his head, but he couldn't leave the wall unstable. If it collapsed again when the cistern was full of water, the surge could split the whole structure. He spent the next 2 days cutting back the fractured section, building slow, controlled fires to smooth the bowl, and reinforcing the patches with more clay and ash fusion. He worked with a grim intensity that silenced even Henry Toller, who rode by and watched from a distance without saying a word. Outside the Morrow claim, the broader basin was bracing for what old-timers called a whistler winter, a season where the wind screamed through the ravines with such force that it could flay the skin off a man's face in minutes. Homesteaders double-banked their firewood, reinforced their sod walls, and checked their water supplies with growing dread. Wooden cisterns, already known to fail, were now viewed with outright fear. A few families had already drained theirs to prevent freeze cracks and were hauling water by the barrel from the creek, which itself was icing over faster each day. The Morrow claim, with its strange stone vault, became the subject of intense speculation. Some said Samuel was building a tomb. Others whispered that he had found a way to cheat the frost entirely, and if he succeeded, no one would ever build a wooden tank again. That tension wound tighter when the first real snow fell on October 29th. 6 inches of dry powder swept in on a north wind, followed by a night of clear skies that plunged the temperature to 10 below zero. The creek froze solid to the bottom in the shallow stretches. By morning, the only flowing water was a thin trickle beneath a foot of ice in the deepest pool. For families without a reservoir, that meant no water without a long, dangerous sled haul to the spring 3 miles away. One family, the Driscolls, tried to make the trip and got lost in a whiteout. They barely made it back with frostbitten feet and an empty barrel. The panic started quietly, a rumor of thirst moving through the scattered claims. At the Morrow cabin, the cistern was finally finished. Samuel had carved a chamber roughly 6 feet deep at its center, wider than a wagon wheel, with a tapered opening that could be covered by a heavy timber lid insulated with straw and sod. The walls were smooth, sealed by fire and clay where the fault had threatened. He had rigged a simple rope-end bucket system for drawing water. On the last day of October, he filled the cistern from the creek bucket by bucket until the water rose to within a foot of the rim. Then he covered it, packed earth around the lid, and stood back. The dark, still water inside was now entombed in living stone, with nearly 5 feet of granite between it and the killing frost. But Samuel did not celebrate. Cora had gone into her confinement that same week. The baby could come any day, and the blizzard that had been threatening now began to build in earnest. The sky turned the color of tarnished pewter, and the wind shifted to the northwest, screaming down from the bighorns with a sound like tearing canvas. That evening, as Samuel lit the cabin fire, He placed his hand flat on the packed earth above the cistern lid. The ground was cold but not frozen. Down in the stone chamber, the water was still liquid. It had to be. Just after midnight, the storm hit, not with a gradual build, but with a single concussive blast that rattled the door and sent ash tumbling from the hearth. The wind shrieked through the chimney, and the entire cabin shuddered. Cora woke with a cry, and Samuel was already on his feet, checking the rope on the door, the window shutters, the warmth of the stove. The children slept through the first hour, but then the cold began seeping through the chinks in the logs, and Caleb woke to the sound of his mother breathing through a pain that was no longer false. The baby was coming, and deep below the cabin floor in the black belly of the stone cistern, the water had begun to move. Not from a leak, not from a crack. The immense pressure of the ground freezing above it, the expansion of ice in the surrounding soil, was squeezing the granite chamber. The water level had risen slightly, pressing against the timber lid like a living thing testing a seal. If the stone had been weak, if the fault had not been sealed, the cistern would already be splitting. But inside the granite vault, the only sound was a quiet, steady lapping against stone. The liquid held. Samuel did not know that yet. He only knew that his wife was in labor in the middle of a blizzard, that the nearest midwife was 8 miles away and unreachable, and that the only water his newborn would drink was now locked underground, waiting for a bucket to break the silence. The storm screamed on. The cabin groaned. And somewhere in the white chaos, the entire frontier winter decided that Samuel Morrow's crazy idea would now face its final, brutal test of survival. The stone had done its work. Now the man had to do his. Cora's labor lasted 18 hours. The storm lasted longer. By the second day, the cabin was an island in a sea of white, the windows buried past the sills, the door only opening because Samuel had rigged a rope to the porch beam. He cleared a narrow trench to the woodpile, then to the cistern lid, shoveling snow that fell faster than he could move it. Inside, Cora gripped the bed frame and breathed through contractions while Caleb and Henry sat wide-eyed by the stove, their small faces pale with a fear they could not name. The baby came early on the third morning, just after the blizzard's peak began to break. A girl, small but wailing, her lungs strong enough to cut through the wind's last howl. Samuel caught her in his own hands, guided by Cora's exhausted instructions and the memory of a midwife's teaching years before. He tied the cord, cleaned the child, and placed her on Cora's chest. For a long moment, the only sound in the cabin was the infant's thin cry and the crackle of the fire. The storm still screamed outside, but inside something had shifted. They had passed through the worst. That was when Samuel reached for the bucket. He had not drawn water from the cistern since the freeze began. The lid was sealed. The drinking supply had come from melted snow. But now Cora needed clean water and the baby needed to be washed. He pulled on his frozen coat, lifted the wooden bar, and pushed against the door. The trench had filled halfway, and he dug through it with a desperate fury. When he reached the cistern, he brushed aside the straw insulation, pried up the heavy timber lid, and looked down. The water was there, still liquid, dark and still, like a mirror in a cave. A faint wisp of steam rose into the frozen air. He lowered the bucket, heard the splash, and hauled it up full. The water was cold but not frozen, clean and clear. He carried it back to the cabin, and Cora drank deep for the first time in 2 days. The stone vault had held. The fire, the ice, the fault, the patch, it had all worked. But that was not the end. That was only the first question answered. The blizzard broke on the 4th day. As the wind died and the clouds peeled back, a pale winter sun revealed a transformed world. Drifts had swallowed fences and buried wagons to their axles. Homesteaders emerged from their cabins like survivors of a shipwreck, blinking and silent. The Driscolls had lost their remaining water barrels to a frozen collapse. The Haygood family had burned half their furniture trying to melt enough snow to keep their children from dehydration. Over the following week, as trails were broken and the basin reconnected, one fact became impossible to ignore. The only family that had not suffered a water crisis was the Morrows. Word spread slowly at first, then with the force of a revelation. Henry Toller rode over and stood beside the cistern, staring at the black water visible through the open lid. He didn't mock. He didn't warn. He only asked to taste it. Samuel drew a cup. Henry drank, wiped his mouth, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife wants one." That was the beginning, but wait, it got bigger. The winter held the basin in a frozen grip for 4 more months, a season of relentless cold that claimed livestock and cracked timber, but the granite cistern never froze. Samuel chipped ice from the rope and bucket, but the water below remained liquid. By February, the Morrow claim had become a quiet curiosity. By March, it was a destination. Homesteaders appeared with sleds and barrels asking to buy water. Not because they were lazy, but because their own cisterns had burst, their springs had frozen solid, and the creek was a solid block of ice 2 feet thick. The Morrow cistern, deep and insulated by living stone, had become the only reliable liquid water within 5 miles. Samuel traded water for firewood, for flour, for nails and kerosene. He refused nothing essential, but he never let the level drop below 3 feet. He calculated constantly, measuring the inflow from snowmelt and the draw from neighbors. The stone chamber became a kind of bank, and he was its careful steward. Then came the spring thaw, and with it, a truth that no one had anticipated. As the snow melted and the creeks roared back to life, most families believed the water crisis had passed. They were wrong. The thaw was followed by the driest summer the Black Hills had seen in a decade. By June, the creeks had shriveled to ribbons of warm mud. By July, the shallow wells began to fail. The land that had nearly killed them with ice now threatened to kill them with dust. And here is where the granite cistern revealed its second, more devastating power. While the water table dropped and surface sources vanished, the deep stone vault at the Morrow claim still held water. The same design that defeated the frost also defeated evaporation. Covered, insulated, sunk into the cool earth, the cistern lost almost nothing to the summer heat. While neighbors hauled barrels from a dwindling spring 3 miles away, Samuel simply lowered his bucket and brought up the same water that had survived the winter. The asset was not seasonal, it was permanent. One afternoon, a delegation arrived. Henry Toller, a weather-beaten sheep farmer named Crispin, and 2 other homesteaders who had lost their wells entirely. They didn't ask for water, they asked for instruction. Could Samuel build a granite cistern for them, on their land, in their rock? They would pay. They knew the labor would be immense. They knew the fire setting would be brutal. But they also knew what they had seen, a family that had not gone thirsty in a season when thirst was the new terror. Samuel listened. Then he named a price that surprised them. Not cash, cash was scarce on the frontier. He wanted cattle. 1 heifer per cistern, delivered the following spring, a breeding pair for a larger project. He would provide the design, oversee the fire setting, and train the landowners in the maintenance of the vault. But they would do the digging, the hauling, the burning under his direction. The deal was struck before sundown. Over the next 3 months, Samuel Morrow did not rest. He carved a second cistern into a granite ledge on Henry Toller's claim, then a third on Crispin's property, then a fourth on a ridge overlooking the Driscoll place. Each one was tailored to the specific rock, the specific drainage, the specific demands of the frost line. The technique evolved. He learned that preheating the stone with smaller fires before the main burn reduced spalling. He found that a mixture of clay and crushed granite dust made a better seal than clay and ash. He trained the boys to monitor burn times, to recognize the sound of a solid fracture versus a dangerous one. Caleb, barely 9 years old, could now tell by the ring of a hammer strike whether the stone was sound or rotten. But here's the thing no one saw coming. The communal cisterns changed the entire settlement. Water security meant families stayed through the hard months instead of fleeing to the lowlands. Livestock survived because drinking water remained available even when the creeks dried. A small trading post that had nearly failed the previous year suddenly had enough traffic to survive. The granite vaults were not just water storage. They were the foundation of an anchored community. And the man who had nearly been called a fool was now the most valuable person in the basin. Yet, as summer turned to autumn and the leaves went yellow again, Samuel noticed something that unsettled him. The original cistern on his own claim, the one that had been tested by the great blizzard, was showing a slight seepage along the patched fault line, a dampness that had not been there before. It was minor, barely a trickle, but it meant that the seal was not permanent. The constant expansion and contraction of the freeze-thaw cycle, the pressure of the water, the subtle settling of the stone, it was all working against the clay fusion. The cistern was not failing, but it was whispering a warning. Samuel knelt beside the fault, pressed his palm against the cool, damp granite, and understood that this problem was not unique to his vault. Every cistern he had built would eventually face the same decay. The seal was a living thing, and it would require maintenance. The question was not whether the cisterns would survive the next winter, but whether the village would survive the winter after that, when the patches began to fail and he was no longer there to repair them. Because the knowledge to fix a granite cistern was still locked inside one man's head. And that man had just realized that his greatest invention carried a ticking clock that no one else could yet hear. Samuel did not sleep that night. The dampness on the fault line had entered his mind like a splinter. By morning, he was kneeling at the edge of the Toller cistern, running his fingers along the seal, then at the Driscoll vault, then at the Crispin site. At each one, he found the same faint, almost imperceptible seepage. Not a crack, not a leak, a sweat. The clay-ash mixture was slowly, inexorably, beginning to lose its bond with the stone. The freeze-thaw cycle of the previous winter had worked into microscopic pores and loosened the fusion. The cisterns were not about to fail, but they were all on the same clock. That afternoon, Samuel called Henry Toller and the other cistern owners to the morrow claim. They gathered in the yard, a rough council of weathered faces and work-hardened hands. Samuel led them to the original vault, lifted the lid, and showed them the damp patch. Then he explained what it meant. Each cistern was a living machine that would need maintenance. He could repair the seals now, but in 5 years, 10 years, the same problem would return. The only permanent solution was to teach every owner not just to use the cistern, but to understand it, to read the stone, to mix the sealant, to build the fires that fused earth into rock. The men listened in silence. Then Crispin, the sheep farmer, spoke. "You're saying we have to learn to be you," Samuel nodded. "A part of me, at least." That was the moment the monopoly broke. Samuel Morrow, who had nearly died alone in a granite hole, began to give away his secret. He started with the seal itself. That winter, while the ground was too frozen for new work, Samuel experimented. He had remembered something Johann Decker, the German stonecutter, had mentioned. Burning limestone at high heat produced a powder that, mixed with sand and water, would harden into a stone-like mortar. The process was ancient. The Romans had used it, but Samuel had no kiln. He built one from a steel barrel lined with clay, fired crushed limestone in it for 2 days, then slaked the resulting quicklime in water until it crumbled into a white paste. He mixed this with granite dust from the cistern cuttings and a small amount of fine clay. The result was a slurry that, when applied to the fault and heated gently with small fires, cured into a seal that was harder and more watertight than anything he had used before. The lime mortar bonded chemically with the granite surface, creating a crystalline lock that the old clay-ash mixture could never achieve. In the spring, he repaired the original cistern with the new seal. The dampness vanished. He then went to each of the other vaults and repeated the process, teaching the owners as he worked. Caleb, now 10, stood beside him, holding the bucket of lime paste, watching every step. Henry Toller's 2 older sons joined in, as did young Ben Driscoll. By the end of the summer, 6 men and boys could mix a lime seal, test the temperature of a curring fire, and recognize the hollow sound of a delaminating patch. But the greater test was still coming. The drought that had scorched the basin in the summer of '84 did not break with winter. The snows were thin that year, barely enough to fill the creeks, and by April of '85, the water table had dropped further. Shallow wells that had always been reliable now brought up only mud. The nearby spring that had served as the basin's last resort shrank to a trickle. Families who had not dug granite cisterns were facing a 3rd season of water panic. Those who were quietly drawing from their vaults, their reserves holding steady. The Morrow herd had grown. The cattle paid for the cisterns now grazed on the ridge above the claim. their calves sturdy and fat on the spring grass that still held moisture in the roots. Samuel's daughter, whom Cora had named Elsie, took her first steps near the cistern lid, her small fingers patting the warm timber that covered the cool, dark water below. The boy Henry, now 7, helped haul buckets with the same quiet seriousness his father carried. The cisterns were no longer an experiment. They were the family's inheritance. And then the outside world took notice. In the summer of 1885, a geological survey party passed through the Black Hills, mapping mineral claims and water resources for the territorial government. The lead surveyor, a lean, bespectacled man named Arthur Vinson, had heard rumors of a homesteader who had carved water vaults into solid granite using nothing but fire. He assumed it was frontier exaggeration. When he saw the Morrow cistern, he spent 3 hours examining it, measuring the depth, the temperature of the water, the composition of the seal. He asked Samuel for the precise burn times, the type of wood, the cooling method. He filled a notebook with diagrams. Then Vincent said something that shifted the entire story onto a larger stage. "There are a dozen mining camps in the Northern Territory," he said, "with workers dying of thirst in winter because their water barrels freeze solid. They use dynamite to blast storage pits, but the explosions shatter the rock and the tanks crack within months. Your fire setting produces a stable chamber with a natural thermal mass. It's a different technique entirely." He paused, tapping his pencil against the notebook. "If you were willing to build one of these at the Homestake Annex, the company would pay you more than cattle. They'd pay you in gold." Samuel considered the offer. He looked at the granite pit that had nearly killed him, at the daughter playing beside it, at the sons who now knew how to read stone. Then he told Vincent he would build a demonstration cistern at the survey camp, but he would not leave the basin. He would train a crew from the camp to maintain it, the same way he had trained his neighbors. The knowledge would be the payment. Vincent agreed, and one of Samuel's trainees, Henry Toller's eldest boy, went north to oversee that first industrial-scale vault. But here was the twist that no one saw coming, not even Samuel. In the process of mixing the lime seal for the original cistern, Samuel had noticed that the powdered granite dust he added as filler was not just inert grit. When combined with the quicklime and clay, it created a chemical reaction that produced a faint effervescence, tiny bubbles of trapped gas that, when the mixture cured, left a network of microscopic voids. Those voids made the seal slightly flexible, able to expand and contract with the stone without cracking. Samuel had accidentally created a rudimentary aerated mortar, a material that mimicked the resilience of natural pumice, centuries before modern concrete science would formally understand the principle. He never called it by a technical name. He simply called it the gray paste, and he taught the recipe to anyone who asked. The paste was the final, hidden secret of the Morrow cisterns. Not the fire, not the ice, not the shape of the vault, but the accidental chemistry that allowed the stone to breathe without breaking. In later years, when engineers would study the surviving granite cisterns of the Black Hills, they would puzzle over the unusual longevity of the seals. Some would attribute it to the quality of the lime, others to the low humidity of the plains. But the real reason was the voids, the tiny bubbles that absorbed stress and kept the water inside. The Morrow family lived on that claim for 3 more decades. Samuel and Cora raised their children and buried 2 of them, Henry, lost to scarlet fever at 12, and a stillborn son before Elsie. The land took and gave. The granite cistern never failed again. Even after Samuel's death in 1909, the vault kept water, and Cora drew from it until her own passing a few years later. Caleb inherited the claim and maintained the seals as his father had taught him. The cistern outlived the original cabin, which burned in a prairie fire in 1912. When a new house was built, it was erected around the same granite vault, still holding cold, clear water drawn from an aquifer of stone. And the broader impact. The Homestake Mining Company adopted fire-setting cisterns at 3 of its satellite camps, and the technique spread through the northern plains mining districts. A few homesteaders in Wyoming and Montana tried to replicate the design, with mixed results. But in the Black Hills Basin where Samuel first lit his fires, the cluster of granite cisterns he built remained functional well into the 20th century. Some were still used by ranchers as late as the 1950s. They became local landmarks, known simply as the Morrow Holes. No plaque, no monument, just stone pits that never ran dry. The final surprising truth, however, was not about the cisterns at all. Decades after Samuel's death, a great drought struck the Black Hills in the 1930s, the Dust Bowl years, when the sky turned black with topsoil and creeks vanished for months. Families in the basin, now descendants of the original homesteaders, scrambled for water. Wells failed. Livestock died in the thousands. But the granite cisterns held, not just the water inside them, but the community itself. Because the knowledge of how to build and maintain those vaults had been passed down through 3 generations, a network of families who still knew the fire-setting technique and the gray paste recipe. They gathered, taught one another, and dug new cisterns into the same ancient rock. The original vault that Samuel had nearly died carving became not just a water source, but a seed of survival that bloomed into a culture of resilience. And so the man who spent one summer drilling holes in granite with fire and ice had not merely solved a seasonal problem. He had cracked open an insight that rippled forward through time, that the deepest security is not built by fighting nature, but by enlisting the stone, the frost, the drought, even the chemistry of dust, to do the work alongside you. The cistern that never froze became the cistern that never forgot. And because of one man's refusal to listen to common sense, an entire settlement learned to drink from the mountain's own cold heart. And so the man who spent one summer drilling holes in granite with fire and ice had not merely solved a seasonal problem. He had cracked open an insight that rippled forward through time, that the deepest security is not built by fighting nature, but by enlisting the stone, the frost, the drought, even the chemistry of dust, to do the work alongside you. The cistern that never froze became the cistern that never forgot, and because of one man's refusal to listen to common sense, an entire settlement learned to drink from the mountain's own cold heart. The question echoes across more than a century. Was Samuel Morrow a forgotten genius who cracked a code of stone and water that others could not? Or was he simply one of the rare men stubborn enough to listen when the granite spoke? It is easy to call him brilliant. He reverse-engineered a technique older than Rome, fused clay with lime and granite dust into a primitive aerated mortar centuries before modern chemistry would name the principle, and built a system that outlived his own children. But maybe brilliance is the wrong word. Maybe what Samuel possessed was not a superior intellect but a superior patience, a willingness to kneel beside a fire-hot pit and hear the difference between a ping and a thump, to read dampness on a fault line like a warning, to treat the winter not as an enemy to defeat, but as a teacher to understand. The frontier was full of people with strong backs and sharp minds. What set Samuel apart was that he did not assume he already knew the answer. He allowed the mountain to correct him. When the rotten feldspar collapsed, he did not abandon the hole, he asked the rock what it needed. When the first seal began to weep, he did not curse the stone, he mixed a better paste. He treated the world as a partner, not an obstacle, and that partnership lasted long after he was gone. Most of the cisterns he built are rubble now. Time, neglect, and shifting ground have reclaimed them. But for 90 years they held, and in the worst seasons they held entire families. The technique itself did not die with Samuel. It walked north to mining camps, west to ranches, down through the hands of his sons and the neighbors who had once laughed at the man burning holes in the granite. The gray paste recipe was never written in a patent office. It was passed like a campfire story, from one cold-beaten homesteader to another. There is a strange comfort in that. We are accustomed to thinking that innovation comes from laboratories and blueprints, from men with degrees and government grants. But survival has no credentials. It borrows fire from a camp kitchen and lime from a creek bank and builds cathedrals of rock beneath the prairie grass, invisible to history, vital to the people standing right there. The Morrow cisterns were not monuments. They were machines of pure necessity, and they worked because the man who built them never stopped paying attention. Perhaps that is the sharper edge of this story. Not that one man endured a brutal winter, but that an entire community learned to endure because he refused to keep the secret. He traded knowledge for cattle, then gave the knowledge away. He trained his skeptics. He let the cure outgrow the doctor. And by doing so, he planted a resilience that survived the next drought, the next blizzard, the next wave of families who would have otherwise fled. The Black Hills still hold that lesson, buried in the ground like a vein of good water. The cistern that never froze was never really about the ice. It was about the listening, the refusal to believe that the way things had always been done was the only way, and the quiet, stubborn faith that fire and water, applied with care, could carve a sanctuary from a tomb. If Samuel Morrow stood here now, he might not call himself brilliant. He would likely shrug, pour a cup of cold water from the stone, and say something about the mountain already knowing the answer. He just happened to be digging in the right place at the right time, with the right fire and the right ears. Subscribe now to uncover more hidden histories of survival and ingenuity that the frontier almost forgot. The next story is already waiting, just beneath the surface.